Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Faith in AI Project. This is the podcast, and we're really excited for this series on the Pope's new encyclical. Very excited for another panel. We have three very, very wonderful experts here with us. But first, we want to thank our sponsors who made this episode possible. We would like to thank ParishStack by PushPay. Are you a parish leader still relying on tools that were built for a different era? Well, you were called to shepherd souls, not to maintain software. That's why PushPay built ParishStack, comprehensive parish platform designed specifically for Catholic parishes. For ParishStack, your staff finally has a clear picture of where every parishioner is on their journey. And for your parishioners, connecting, giving, and serving at your parish is as easy as a tap on their phone. Imagine that, Julianne. The difference between managing your parish and growing it matters. Move out of maintenance and advance your mission. Schedule a live demo today at pushpay.com. Thank you all so much for being here. Just wanted to open with your thoughts, just general things that stood out to you from the encyclical, or even just, the context around which you became aware of it or aware of its publication. Would love to open the floor to you guys, and feel free to talk over one another and engage in vigorous dialogue.
This is really interesting because word had kind of percolated through the world of the church, even during the Jubilee last year, that this document was coming. And we had some meetings last year for the Jubilee year with some various Vatican officials. It was interesting to hear their level of excitement about the encyclical. Encyclicals go through various levels of formality, editing. There's committees that need to see it and pass along, check on various things. And so we were hearing the rumblings across the Vatican dicasteries about this document and how groundbreaking it was even then. And so we were prepping for something that was maybe more narrowly focused on AI, and actually it was a beautiful surprise to us how intertwined it is with almost every issue that we're facing today. Raising children. I love the section on limits around social media usage and listening to some of the newest research and how it's impacting education. It's talking about just war theory and its validity today, political discourse, the role of the Holy See in looking at ethics. So I think it's much more expansive than we initially had heard. And I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And coming from the builder side in particular, I think myself, I had some concerns that it would be a little bit too proscriptive, or maybe too much in the technical vein, which isn't in my mind, in the role of the church. Not only because the technology moves so quickly and it requires the practitioners to really integrate their understanding of what the church teaches into the actual, keystrokes that build these models, but also because it would kind of move the locus of responsibility or authority out of the labs and out of the tech sphere, where the locus of responsibility should clearly stay. And I was grateful to see that that maintained as part of this document, and the exhortations that Pope Leo gives all of us who are building in this technology that has such a mighty impact on the world. The ways in which we should be thinking about this, the ways in which we should be building this, and a better explanation of who the human person is that we're building for, both in terms of the epistemological considerations, the decision-making considerations, and most importantly, the social and family considerations, because we all find ourselves in these network of relationships rather than kind of these abstracted individuals lonely building behind the computer screen.
Mm.
Yeah, I can
Well,
only agree with that also. Pope Leo spends a lot of time constructing the framework around which he is going to compare the use of AI to the human person. And I know that Taylor likes to talk about the anthropology of the church, but almost three chapters of 5 go into that framework, so that he can say, So this is the church's view of the human person. And we have to be careful that AI is used to enhance that and not to its detriment.
Hmm.
So perhaps some people were expecting a little bit less of, for example, the social doctrine of the church or uh, the anthropological considerations of what is the human person. But I think Pope Leo realizes that that is essential so that when he talks about how humans use AI as a tool, um, it's understood within the context of what the Bible and of course what the Catholic Church believes about the human being. Interesting to see some people in the press call Leo a Luddite. So some say that he hates the technology, that he's against it, and others call him a technologist in the sense that he's pro tech. He too much, too he's in love with the technology. Uh, so I think that's just part of Leo's greatness that he can strike a balance. He, he, he he made everybody mad. He did. He's not going to side with anyone. He does mention at the beginning that we can't be against the technology because that's useless, but we have to realize that it is not neutral. I thought that was an interesting phrase. It is not neutral. When you use the technology, you're already aligning yourself to a certain path. Uh, but he does say it's not intrinsically evil, and I thought that was also important.
I agree with you, Father Philip, on that. I think it comes toward the beginning of the encyclical, but his terminology there I found really interesting. He says we need to avoid um, the idolatry of AI and also demonizing it. So he uses two very, very interesting religious paradigms there to remind us that there is value here, but it has to serve the human person. And, it's so interesting because a lot of people in the world of the church are scared of AI. And again, they're using particularly generative AI in all kinds of ways. And when you remind them of that, they get a little bit sheepish. But what I love about the nuances and the complexity of the issue is that the Holy Father situates the human person at the center of that. And I think this conversation is so timely because we are only realizing today some of the damage, some of the negative effects. Of course, there's certainly positive effects of things like, for example, social media, but we're certainly recognizing the negative effects and the unbridled access that young people have through devices that they carry in their pockets without any limits. And one of the things that I love, there's a section that comes around 222 where he talks about the Holy See being at the service of this conversation, that we do have to look at drawing people together and that the Holy See wants to be at the center of that because we need to be having this conversation now before artificial technology, before the toothpaste is out of the box, if you will, or the tube, I think is the analogy over here. And we don't have any constraints or guidelines in place. And we cannot let companies with vested material interests set those expectations for us, but that we need to be having the conversation now. So I really appreciated that that it's a prophetic lens he has on this. He wants to get ahead of it and center it in the human person. Really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
no,
it, Jeff.
I completely agree, and I think it's really interesting too and timely that tech is so interested in this happening as well. The kind of the unprecedented appearance of Chris as part of the event for this, I think shows the way in which tech has looked at its own history, at its own bringing devices and cell phones and social media into the world, and the impact it's had not only on ourselves and our children. In fact, it's very common in the tech space to have parents not give their children devices or have them on social media until well into their teenage years, which I find fascinating, right? Just because we, as the builders of this, see the impact that it has, and I think that learning from the last couple decades with regard to these two technologies has tech looking at this in a different sort of way, and very grateful to the collaboration with the Vatican and understanding and having a richer anthropology that we can apply to the development of these technologies, because of course tech's expertise is not anthropology, and we look to a wide variety of different religions and cultures to understand that in a better way, to be in better service of humanity where we may not have been more recently.
Taylor,
Yeah, Julianne, to your point, if I can interject, uh,
Yeah.
most of the people that I speak with when I go around giving conferences and whatnot are scared. So the prevailing sentiment is fear.
Yeah.
And there are many reasons for that. I think it's primarily because they don't quite understand the technology, and also because they're afraid of losing their jobs to an AI. About 10 days ago, there were 3 commencement speakers in the U.S. That were booed by their audiences. One was Eric Schmidt, a friend that I've known for over 10 years, a former CEO of Google at the University of Arizona. And I remember seeing his speech was quite well done, and I think Eric is one of the experts in terms of the development of AI. He's not, well, he is a computer scientist, but that he's not working on the AI itself. He leaves that to the engineers. But you could see in his face he was shocked when the audience booed him. And I actually myself was very surprised. I'm like, why are they booing him? And I think it's because of that fear. They don't want to, the students don't want to hear about AI. And here I am thinking, well, this is one of the foremost experts in AI, especially in relationship to China, because he goes to China a lot. And that is really the US's competitor. And they're booing him. They don't wanna listen. He even says, "Can I finish this point?" And they said, "No." They don't want him to finish the point. And then there were other 2 commencement speakers that had the same thing. So I kinda wanted to ask, Julianne and Taylor, why did they do that? Because also you have to remember that 70% of students are using AI in some way. Different platforms. I mean, my students, they know all the platforms. They know which are best. They say, "Oh, Claude is best for coding. OpenAI, the paid version, is best for cheating on assignments. Perplexity is good because it will take over your computer to start doing your assignments for you, etc." It's an eye opener to hear the students talk about AI. But I did find that rather ironic, or just strange that they would boo these commencement speakers.
This is really an interesting phenomenon. I was thinking about this. I was with a group of church leaders last week, and the subject of AI came up. And they were of a particular age, a little bit older, but there was a couple of young people in the room. And what I noticed was the older speakers were a little bit more, or the presenters were a little bit more nervous and fearful. And the younger people had sort of a very different, they had very defined views on AI, which surprised me. But it makes sense, of course, because they're growing up in such a technological world, for example. And I was surprised by how negative they perceived, particularly design and writing and speaking, because they value authenticity. So when you look at, for example, some of the, what they call the Gen Z well-being snapshot, they're growing up the most socially and digitally connected generation in the world, in the history of the world, and yet they're the most emotionally isolated. And so they can detect nuances and authentics around communication, around messaging that is much more, I think, subtle at times than different generations would have been able to detect. But because they're growing up in this world, they have this nose for it. And what's interesting to me is they were speaking very forthright and very frankly about the effect that this is all having on them cumulatively. The fact that they can't trust things. The fact that there's visual overload, particularly with AI-generated graphics that are hard for them to perceive because there's so much disinformation. The synapses of the brain are crossing so dramatically quickly, much more quickly than the previous generations. We know their brains are actually changing by what they're interacting with. And what they're desiring is authentic spaces to dialogue about things that matter. And when we put out AI-generated content in front of them to replace, I think, human relationship and also the mess of human communication. It should be a little bit messy. It should feel more authentic. They can perceive that. And so for me, that's a nuance that I am learning even with my own children, is they have quite defined and strong views on AI in particular and technology overall. We shouldn't be surprised by this. We've raised them to grow up with this technology. And so now they have opinions, they have preferences, and this is going to shape not just the world of the world in general, but certainly the world of the church, by which we bring people into relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, that's great. Father, you're so good. You just cut right to my notes here. It is Glendale Community College. There also was an AI name reader. This is May 15,
Yeah.
2026. That messed up and people started booing. The college later apologized and let the affected students rewalk. There's also Eric Schmidt. I believe you mentioned that at University of Arizona. At UCF, a speaker was booed when he mentioned the next industrial revolution. And then Jeremy Scott was cheered at Kansas City Art Institute for tearing up an AI written speech. I think he kind of dramatically said, "Here's my AI written speech," and teared it up, and people cheered. So it's very interesting. Taylor, do you have any thoughts on this, on this kind of disconnect? I wonder too if also income inequality or just this kind of uncertainty about career in light of this huge
Yeah.
shift happening that's affecting economies and things like that, and displacement of workers and companies saying that they're laying off mass amounts of people due to AI.
Yeah, I think it is all part and parcel of that, fears about the human person do come home very strongly when they hit you in the pocketbook. Whether you're a tech worker who thinks that this technology can replace you, or if you're a recent grad and you were seeing some of the job and employment numbers come in with regard to how it's possible that the AI is affecting those as well. I think there's kind of three things that I think to think about in this context. And one is, and Father Philip kind of touched on this already, is you fear what you don't understand. The teams that I work with across both inside Microsoft and outside, although of course all of my comments here today are my own personal ones. The ones who really adopt AI well are the ones who understand the technology well and understand how it fits into their own metacognitive strategies, how they interact with it, how they think about it, how they work with it, and they know what it's good for and what it's not good for. Once they've kind of disabused themselves of that view of the technology can replace me as a result of getting to know it well, their tone shifts, the way in which they approach their work in collaboration with AI really shifts, because they do see it as this tool, as this thing that they can build with, that expands their own work and expands their own excitement. From a builder standpoint, particularly in the like startup Silicon Valley sort of ethos, there's never been a more exciting time in many ways, and I think that enthusiasm and that excitement interestingly carries through in some ways in this encyclical when understanding the technology in the appropriate sort of builder mindset rather than in a human replacement mindset. Second, and I love the quote from Tolkien, Gandalf. I think it's in paragraph 213, with regard to ensuring that we root out the problems that we're aware of that we can in our time and age, so that we're able to give the next generation new, fresh soil to till. I'm not sure we've done a very good job of that in tech. I think that the way in which the cell phone has kind of pervaded all aspects of our personal lives, again in many ways similar to the Ring and its impact on Gollum. The way in which that has reduced our connection between people, the way in which that's kind of supplanted our desire to have more in-person social interactions. even accidentally. In some ways, it's something that we couldn't have anticipated when we were coming out with this technology, and so I don't, pin it on anybody that it was an intentional sort of thing that was done. But looking back on it, we definitely learned a lot of lessons from this, and I think a lot of the world is looking at tech and saying, "Hey, sure, you've done some great things, but you've also kind of impacted our relationships, our society, our culture, and we want something different this go around." Even those of us in tech want something different this go around because we haven't been happy with the way things have turned out with some of the technological developments that have happened over the last decade or two. And I think the third thing that I want to say with regard to how people are approaching this is that we can kind of point to these big tech companies or these big governments or nations or try to abstract away the power each of us has in our own thinking, decision making, and moral judgment, when in fact the only control we have over any sorts of decisions being made are our own. And so the way in which the encyclical kind of drives back the onus of action to each of us individually, wherever we are in our daily work, in our world, I think is such an empowering, important thing for each of us to really own and understand that that I bring to every conversation I have with undergraduates or those looking for work or my fellow friends building this technology and tech is you have authority, you have decision-making capacity, you have co-creative capacity here that you can bring to the problems that you're encountering in your everyday, and that's your job, and that's the exciting thing that you're able to do as a human being, as this representative of this magnificent humanity.
Taylor, I love that you mentioned asking something different of Silicon Valley, and throughout the document, Pope Leo kind of lays before us again and again these two paths, these two options of either building the Tower of Babel or rebuilding Jerusalem. And especially in chapter 5, laying before us in a similar way, the culture of power compared to the civilization of love. There's this tension between these two things. And I'm interested, especially because often I find in conversations, especially younger people are maybe not as, just my own small sample size, like not as hopeful that they could imagine the world changing for the better. A lot of times it's more like we've been discussing, like the world is going to change for the worse over time, not for the better. And it's interesting for people who don't know, the Rome Call for AI Ethics in 2020 was signed, and it brought together a lot of different organizations. Microsoft was in the room. And then again, I think for me, this was one of the more surprising things, or the more kind of important things, was Anthropic being present at the launch of this document. Vatican brought Anthropic's interpretability lead onto the stage, and he gave a short speech. I'm wondering, Taylor, do you feel Microsoft and these companies at the time in 2020, they're moving in the same direction that the Vatican was, or a different one? Like what has kind of happened between 2020, 2026? Because it seems, I think most people would be shocked that back in 2020, there was this kind of coming together. I think there was a cardinal there, the Rome Call for Ethics, IBM, Microsoft, and now when you go on the website, I mean, tons of companies that are asking for ethics around artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's important that you brought this up, particularly in the context of chapter 5. But I'm going to kind of speak from tech broadly, not from any individual company, because of course they come at these things from slightly different, nuanced worldviews. But I'm going to put on my builder hat. When we build technology, we need a customer. And as we've developed this technology, we've realized that our customer has moved from something that we can observe their actions and take different product directions on the basis of their utilization of deterministic tools, to a customer that is co-creating their own experiences with these tools because of the nature of the technology. That co-creative aspect has moved some of the ways in which we're able to understand our customer inside the customer's head, where we no longer have access to it in the same sort of product making sort of way. And I don't mean this in any sort of forensic sort of capacity. It's just that this is how we build product. We watch how people do things. We change the design interfaces and the ways in which these products operate in order to match that better. But now these actions have moved inside to the cognitive. When you're coming to an insight, when you're making a decision, all of that is kind of happening inside the person, and we have less direct access to it. We can ask the person how they are going about making their decisions. We can ask the person what they might want changed in order to have a better experience. But notice too, that isn't direct data. It's the customer mediating their own experience or their own understanding of how they're going about these activities inside of their head in order to tell us how we should make our tools or our experiences different or better. What this means then is that every time we are shipping or sending out a new generative AI product or agentic AI product, we're implicitly shipping a certain understanding of the human anthropology. But as I've said earlier in our conversation, right, tech is not the authority on human anthropologies, nor do we want to be. We just want to make good products for people so that they continue, paying their monthly subscription fee or what have you, because we're in the business of making cool tech things. And so how do we go about this problem? We can't be shipping products that are designed for an anthropology that actually doesn't exist out there. We're shipping to customers that don't exist as a result. And so the way in which I see this having developed over the last 6 years, and this is too, as the encyclical notes, kind of a discovery on our part as well, because of the nature of these probabilistic products, is we need to understand and I'm not sure any particular company would actually state this, right? Because it ends up being so academic, but we need to understand who this human person is in order to have our products actually resonate better with the customer. Because right now we're shipping things that don't quite work. Oh, they don't want it to be sycophantic. Oh, they don't want to be able to produce images in this way. Like it's a almost a scattergun sort of approach to product development, because our product development tools have changed as a result of these probabilistic products and the co-creative nature in which every customer is building with us in a probabilistic sort of fashion. So where do we go? We go to people and cultures and different places who have a much richer understanding of the human person, so that as we're developing these things, and perhaps we'll call it ethics, perhaps we'll call it alignment, perhaps we'll call it responsible AI, but undergirding all of those kinds of concepts and all of those ways in which we're trying to approach this from a product standpoint is this: we need a deeper understanding of the human person. We need a deeper understanding of the way in which people make judgments, or the way in which they decide whether they have enough information to say that something is true or not. And all of those come from the other side of campus, as it were, in the liberal arts fashion, rather than necessarily in the computer science and engineering departments.
Julianne, what's your read on some of these things? I mean, I'm trying to navigate with the Silicon Valley, the Vatican, but then also people in the pews. You interact with the people in the pews very directly. So what is your kind of either the sense of them towards AI companies? We've touched on that a little bit with the college graduates, but like the fear and also the questions, I guess, about the human person. I think sometimes when I talk to people about those things, they're like, I mean, I don't have time to think about what human dignity means, or what, like, if the Vatican says it, then I believe it, and I don't want to go much deeper than that.
Yeah, I think this is something that chapter 5 actually talks about directly, I think, in really nuanced ways. which is the effect on the human person. And we're seeing a couple of things. So Father Philip, as a philosopher, I'm sure you were listening, but he talks about nihilism, pragmatism, and Manichaeism. So, there's this extreme dualism that's happening. And I think you also see it in the political world. You see it just even mirrored at the church. You see people who are absolutely afraid of AI and those that think it should be embraced wholeheartedly without any constraints on it. And have really put their faith in, well, regulations are there to protect the human person, and, governments and world leaders will do their job. And I think what we're learning is the complexity of this is such that, as Taylor just explained, there are networks of interdependence with AI that are created that are difficult to map. And so I think for a lot of people in the parishes, there's sort of a wait and see attitude. The problem is we can't wait and see with this. The church was very slow when it came to embracing social media, for example, as a paradigm for evangelization, to reach people with the good news of Jesus Christ. It cannot be. It needs to be at the forefront of this conversation rather than the back end, because it is impacting so very directly the experience of everyday life for most people. So some people say, well, I don't have a computer, I don't turn it on. But, so many of the processes by which we're interacting in banking, in our food supply networks are all impacted by algorithms and AI. And I think this is where we have to press into, I think, a little bit of that fear with parish leaders to say this, regardless of whether you are interacting with it through a screen, it is happening around you because there's an ecosystem being created and networks of interdependence, as Pope Leo speaks of, and we cannot be resigned. And so I love this aspect that Pope Leo talks about. He said, some people might say this is a very pessimistic view, that there's so much happening that is causing like the breakdown, the fragmentation, even of things like multilateralism on the political stage. But he said, what we need to develop is a healthy realism, because realism is not resignation. And then the other thing I found really, really beautiful phraseology from him is he talks about we need to shift from a culture of power to a genuine culture of dialogue and negotiation. Because there is, and he says this very directly, there are cultures of spiritual blindness that are developing right now. And false narratives are emerging. And we're not limited to just denouncing evil, but actually we can acknowledge as Christians the darkness without being overcome it. So I think that this is a huge opportunity for us as a church to help create spaces where we can dialogue about these things and sort of peel the layer back for people so that they can understand, certainly acknowledge, but then one of the things I think we all picked up on the Tolkien quote, which is like, have we ever seen this before? No, but he puts it in the context of small, steadfast acts of love will create this culture of interdependence rather than grand supreme gestures. And you can feel his Augustinian spirituality coming through there when he's talking about things like discernment and the collective responsibility of us to look at solidarity and mercy and things like that. So I think we can make these spaces safe. I think we can bring folks together, as you are doing here today, to really unpack various levels, because I think the tech can be very scary. But listening to Taylor reminds me, for example, the duty that I have as a parent to educate my children alongside the technologies that's growing, and then also to look at parish leaders and help them understand, let's not approach this from a fear-based reality, but from what Pope Leo would say is that healthy realism that we're called to as Christians.
Yeah, Edmund, if I could just interject,
Go for it, please do.
the call from Rome is still alive and well. It was drafted by Archbishop Paglia, who was the chancellor of the Academy of Life. But the person who really wrote it was Father Paolo Benanti, who teaches at the Gregorian University, also at Luis, which is a business school in Rome. And Taylor and I were with him just a couple weeks ago. And a very smart guy. The person from Microsoft was Brad Smith, who's actually the president. And he had been to the Vatican several times and was very keen on supporting this initiative, which started with just a few signatures and has now bloomed into several hundreds, I believe. Uh, Archbishop Paglia has now been replaced. He is in retirement, um, but before he actually left, he went to Abu Dhabi and got a bunch of Islamic leaders to sign, which I thought was interesting. Um, a lot of times, I think Julianne would agree. A lot of times when we talk about these issues, we talk about it from a purely Western point of view. But we have to remember that this is global, and we need to understand how the East looks at these kinds of things, and especially what is the anthropological framework of the people in the Far East. Uh,
Yeah.
if I can unabashedly plug my book, Artificial Humanity was translated into Chinese last year, and it was featured at the Hong Kong Book Festival. Um, and I was very happy about that. And I'm receiving a lot of interesting feedback because the book is written from a very Western point, a Aristotelian Thomistic point of view, as Edmund you mentioned, and so it's fascinating to see how uh, the eastern uh, uh, the eastern countries are coming at this issue. Uh, I think that the call from Rome is going to be significant because it deals primarily with ethics. And there are six domains. I don't know if you want to go into that, but there's six domains where it identifies the ethical concerns that the Vatican has in terms of AI. Let me just also reiterate your comment about, and Taylor's also, Christopher Olaf. The relationship between the Vatican and Anthropic goes back also a couple of years. And they've together they've already had a couple of sessions. The one that I knew about was in San Francisco with Brian Greene, Ron Ivey, and a bunch of other people. And apparently that was quite instructive. And I think that that was one of the reasons why Pope Leo asked Chris to come along. It is, and Taylor mentioned this also, it is vital that the Vatican dialogue with people creating this technology. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere. It's just, it's just hot air. Uh, and I hope that the people in who are actually constructing the technology will listen to Pope Leo. And according to what Taylor was saying, they actually might, because they're interested in what constitutes a human person. Okay, maybe to make a better product. So whatever. But the important thing is they're attentive to what really makes us human, and an understanding of the human person that the church can give to them.
Mm. Yeah, I noticed in this chapter the section where Pope Leo is talking about the crisis of multilateralism. Maybe Father, if you could speak, I'm very fascinated by the idea of the East and the West, and how we might here in the West not understand or appreciate or even think about those differences. Like what does Pope Leo mean by a crisis of multilateralism, and what are some of the characteristics or differences on how the East and the West approach any of these topics, but particularly AI?
Well, that's a huge topic, and that may
Okay,
take
sorry.
us, it
I'll
may
make
take
it
us a
more
couple of
specific.
months to think. With multilateralism, I think he's referring to the number of actors that are in play on a world scale,
Mm,
and so there are many focal points that one has to be aware of.
mhm,
Um, I will mention last year, I think it was Forbes magazine. They came out with a statistic that 70% of casualties in the Ukraine war were caused by drones, and
mm,
chapter 5 talks about drones as well. The United Nations has been fighting, so that there's kind of like a world consensus against lethal autonomous weapons. I don't think they're winning that battle. I know they're not winning that battle. Even and Pope Leo says that there needs to be a kind of reform in terms of what the United Nations can do, because he is calling for a global supervision role of someone or something above the state, above the nations, that can control this. Because as we know, these platforms are multinational. They're well, actually, he uses the word transnational. They're based, in different places, but they have their paws, so to speak, everywhere. Um, let me just give you a quick example, because I lived in Italy for 35 years, and I spoke with several generals uh, in the Air Force there, and they're against autonomous weapons. They said, no, we want humans in the loop, and the reason is so that they can control what the drone does. Because once you give the drone autonomy, you kind of have to just put your hands up and say, well, okay. There was a case in Afghanistan where a drone wiped out a funeral party. And hey, you told it to attack when it saw a threat, and it thought this was a threat, when in fact it wasn't. Um, in Italy, it's illegal to ship a weaponized drone. Okay,
Mm.
so and Italy is an exporter of drones. I think the first is the U.S., second is Israel, China's third, and Italy is fourth. So they're up there. So how do the generals get around that? They use two boxes. In one box, they put the drone, and in the other box, they put the weapon, and then
Oh,
they
man.
ship them to the same place. Now, apparently, that's legal, but obviously, that it's going against the intent of the law, which is trying to curtail the use of weaponized drones. But yeah, we've lost that battle. And Leo says maybe we can come back. He says no one ever wins anything with a war. He's absolutely right. Um,
Mm.
and once wars start, it's very hard to stop them. But he is
Mm.
hopeful, and I think Julianne highlighted this briefly. He is hopeful that we can get back to a situation where we don't use war in order to get our way, or in order to do what we want.
Can I pick up a couple of things that Father Philip said that really, I was thinking about this, particularly with Pope Leo's emphasis on the crisis of multilateralism, where he talks about the simplistic narratives that reduce people to friend or foe. And he actually uses that language, right? That is
Yeah.
the language of extreme dualism, Manichaeism, right? Which puts people into categories. And he actually says, in this context, diversity and the strength and the giftedness of people is perceived as a threat, which I find really, really interesting. I am old enough to remember, I was only 20 years of age when the Good Friday Agreement was brokered in Ireland in 1998. And I lived in the south of Ireland, but when I went to college, I sat next to students from the north of Ireland who had very, very different experiences growing up at a time when life in the north of Ireland was very much marked by conflict and war. And in fact, my parents sent me up the north of Ireland to live with the family to facilitate deeper understanding of people from different faith traditions. And it was eye-opening for me to live with a family whose life was so different and whose faith was so different than mine. What I appreciate very much about Pope Leo's emphasis in this section, particularly on war, are the conditions that he indicates are lead up to war, these insidious factors, which AI actually accelerates. And he lists a couple of them, and he speaks of them in the context of this culture of power, and this the culture of power infiltrates society, he says, changes relationships and behaviors. And here's how it grows. It begins by normalizing war, pursuing ever greater military power, taking advantage of the crisis of multilateralism, where dialogue is not happening, and fueling a false realism that insists that there is no alternative. And then he says, fragmented networks, which polarize people. And he uses the term fake news, actually, in this respect, that the algorithm will actually highlight and amplify these echo chambers around war. In the middle of all that, the experience of the human person gets missed. And so I particularly appreciate that on the one hand, he's He's calling out the ability of the AI to magnify and amplify situations where warmongering is actively happening. And then at the same time, he talks about the downgrading of technology, or the downgrading of historical memory around certain issues, that we have technology that is so on a futuristic pace that the past is forgotten. And so there's no collective memory around war. And he uses the Holocaust as an example of that. I think this is a very dangerous place to be, which is why I think he talks about the project to build a civilization of love. And while that language maybe isn't as familiar to us in the church, he says this is in section 187. The project for civilization of love, which was a term used by Pope Paul VI, must undertake the task of transforming this imposed interdependence into a willed and chosen solidarity. So what he's talking about there is dialogue that is intentional, that is willed, and that presumes genuine goodwill on the part of the other, where diversity is respected, and where people pledge to come and agree together on some of the conditions needed for change. So I appreciate, Father Philip, your emphasis on some of the nuances around this, because I think it helps us to think critically, also philosophically. When we're hearing the Pope use terms like nihilism and pragmatism, they're leading to something else, because we've seen these movements and what they've led to in the past. They're just accelerated today by the technological forces that are shaping it.
Taylor, I'm interested in how you would comment on this as well from your experience. Just to note, in paragraph 205, Pope Leo, I think, makes this really focused, where he says the false realism is based not only on prevailing mentality of force, but on the cultural and anthropological belief that war is an inevitable part of human nature. And it kind of goes to what you're saying, Julianne. Like we have to resist this at all levels, and especially at these higher levels of corporations. It's also interesting to note that Pope Leo even says in the encyclical, and the part where he's talking about subsidiarity, he says in that vein, corporations, or I forget exactly how he phrases it, corporations are above even governments. Like I think one of you had mentioned, like they have these cross-country influence that's so powerful. So Taylor, the race to AGI, artificial general intelligence, for some people in the audience might not have heard that. That's another big factor. Like it's inevitable that someone's going to build it, so we have to get there first. What do you make of that, Taylor? Is that actually something that we can somehow affect these companies who seem to be racing for war or AGI, and because of this false realism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there's a couple of different ways to answer that. I mean, there is sort of a similarity between, I think, that we're seeing between the ways in which this artificial intelligence can be weaponized in the similar way that we saw with the nuclear arms race as well, where if you have the bigger, badder machine, you're going to be able to, protect yourself against the person who inevitably is also building their bigger, badder machine. And it is, as Father Philip said, kind of a zero-sum game in the end, right? I mean, we saw how the Cold War ended up. We saw how this kind of standoffishness ends up being a problem for our culture and for our species. And I think the Pope's call out here is important, because what it does is it shifts the human tendency to this dualism, which is ancient, right? Like it's cropped up in every era in some fashion, and this is just the most recent iteration of it. Of the sort of, the bad guys are on one side and the good guys are on the other side, and we'll be able to eradicate the bad guys. But this encyclical does something that I find that Alexander Solzhenitsyn sums up beautifully, of reminding us that, of course, there is no big group of bad guys, and there is no big group of good guys. And actually, the line between good and evil runs right through the center of every human heart. And it's really
My favorite
hard,
quote.
right? And it's really hard to cut out a piece of your own heart. And so that's what this encyclical is really, really kind of helping us remember and focus on. In fact, I think that structurally it's absolutely beautiful and fascinating to me that he starts out with this kind of historical remembering of all of the different pieces of Catholic social teaching to kind of weave this patina for us of, look, we've had to think through this in other sorts of ways as these different seismic shifts in culture and dialogue and democracy and governance across the world have changed, and now we have another one. Let's learn from those historical lessons and bring the onus of decision making back to us as individuals, which is the only place in which these things can shift anyway. And so I think too that we're seeing this kind of extra governmental entities aren't new either. I mean, we saw them. This is part of the reference, I think, to colonialism and then things like the East India Trading Company. And of course, there were networks in ancient times very similar to corporations in their current extent too. That do need more of this decision-making responsibility in the ways in which they're shaping economies and the ways in which they're shaping culture. And I applaud the careful language and thread that the Pope builds throughout this encyclical of bringing all of that responsibility back home to where it belongs, in our own hearts, in our own decision-making, in our daily work, wherever that finds us.
Father Philip and
Edward, if I
Julianne.
could just
Oh,
mention,
go for it, Father. Go for it.
yeah, what are piggybacking on what Taylor said, one of the things the Pope mentions in chapter 5 is should we allow an AI to make a moral decision? And he says, no, they're not capable of doing that. First of all, they can't decide between good and evil. And again, Taylor knows better than Julianne and myself. You could probably write some instructions or write some rules that indicate the difference between good and evil. But Pope Leo says, in order to make a moral decision, you need a conscience, you need responsibility, you need a life, and you need accountability. And he says AIs don't have that. So this is kind of new, because I have heard people say that we should just farm off moral decisions to an AI because they'll be more rational about it and they'll come up with a better decision. No, I understand the rationale behind that, especially if you talk about the use of nuclear weapons, and AI would probably not allow us to use nuclear weapons because no one's going to win that game either. Even though Pope Leo talks about miniature nuclear weapons, did you see that? He talks about very, very small. I think they're calling them tactical nukes. Well, in my experience, there is no such thing as a small nuclear weapon. I mean, you either go nuclear or you don't. And again, we have weapons that can destroy the world several times over. But I think that tactical nuclear weapons is a misnomer. I don't think it's the same thing as like a contained nuclear weapon where you can set these things off and nothing will happen. So interesting how we're not going to solve our moral dilemmas by using an AI. I thought that was an interesting insight.
Yeah, it's also interesting that Pope Leo goes into, he uses this word disarm a lot, speaking of bombs.
Yeah.
But he goes into, in paragraph 214, the first contribution we can make toward a more humane civilization is be mindful of our words. And I wonder if people listening or reading that would be like, huh? Because, you hear things Taylor and Father speaking about, you read about some of these things, the three refusals of moral agents, false realism, war being inevitable, Manichaean binary, and you think, gosh, what could I do? And then Pope Leo says, well, you could we need to disarm these weapons by disarming our words. I wonder, Julianne, it made me think of you, Julianne, like what comes to mind with that? And one last quote actually here is, peace begins with each one of us in the way we look at others, listen to others, and speak about others. And again, saying that if we disarm our words, will help disarm the world. I just think that's such an interesting way to follow up the practical from this like scary reality.
Yeah, I think if you've been watching Pope Leo, so last year when he he stepped onto that papal balcony, and the next day he had the conversation with the College of Cardinals, and he gave his address. He identified 7 fundamental priorities for the church, and one of them right away was AI. But he situated them within the context of this listening synodal church, a pathway where we listen attentively, not just to each other, but to the Holy Spirit who is guiding us. And so that kind of slipped in there. I thought the AI piece kind of raised some eyebrows, but he kind of went on. But it's always been surrounded by his appeal for peace. Those were his first words as a Holy Father. And, one of the other documents where you can pick up some of the threads of where he was going in Magnifica Humanitas is this document that he wrote on Catholic education. Has anybody read it carefully? You'll see it's called New Maps of Hope. And he talks in there about blessed are the peacemakers. Peacemaking becomes the way to educate. And so he talks in there about words. And then this particular Lent, he talked about the use of words that distort, destroy, create doubt, drive cultures of despair. So all the big D's of darkness, I sometimes say, right? They all show up. So if you've been watching his papacy from the moment he stepped on that balcony to the release of the encyclical, and can we talk about the name of the encyclical too? I mean, the human person, the magnificence of humanity centered at the very center of this, but not at the service of the world, but at the service of Jesus Christ to build a kingdom of peace. And one of my favorite expressions in there is, it's gone unnoticed, but he talks about us being weavers of hope. And I love that analogy. He's using builders of communion, weavers of hope, that in each thread of conversation that we have, we can be builders of communion and builders of engagement and encouragement. What's interesting too is somebody said to me, I don't understand this whole disarm our words. What does that mean? I even think that our language can become violent and can be shaped by technology more than it's shaped by human reality. Like phrases like shoot from the hip, which, roll off the tongue. But if you're in a neighborhood with large and rates of historic violence, shoot from the hip is a phrase that carries a very, very different connotation. I think we need to be careful of our words. I think we need to be people of peace in our words. And I also think that part of that means not being afraid, not being complicit around cultures of violence and war and unjust powers. And he talks about this, that create new chains that enslave people. And so, yes, we can be people of peace. I think people think being a person of peace means sitting at home and praying and going to Mass at my parish and doing my best. That's part of it. But it's also not being afraid to speak up, to speak out, because we have a voice for a reason, and to be engaging in the public square in conversations that are difficult. I think part of the drive that we're seeing today is that faith should be private. It should be kept out of conversations like this. And I think what Pope Leo has done is catapult us into the midst of this really exciting time and this really exciting conversation, and encouraging us to dialogue at a time when we would just want to leave the talking to the powers that be. That's just not acceptable, I think, for us as Christians today. It is really to engage fully with all that is required, even if we don't understand it, to say, I'm not sure of the nuances of this, but let's dialogue together, let's build together. That's where we learn, that's where we grow.
Well, I think it has even more importance given kind of maybe 3 different concepts here. One is, of course, our church is built on the Word, quite literally, right? Second, the incredible things that we're seeing out of AI is coming from large language models, right? Like it's built entirely on human language across hundreds, if not dozens, if not hundreds of different human languages, and our own historical linguistic corpus going back to the early days of history. Um, and then the third thing, and this is fascinating, I think, from a nerdy philosophy epistemological standpoint, is that Aquinas' only natural analog for the Trinity is actually the operations of our own mind, with the concept of inner word and outer word. And so you can kind of see that the church's concern with words is kind of shot through the entire structure, our worship, like everything ends up having so much importance and emphasis on the explosions of sound coming out of my mouth that are shaping the context and concepts that we're able to talk about and probe at together. It is our mediating factor, and being careful with those is something that the church has always held very firm. In fact, I was at an ordination this weekend. A good friend of mine was ordained to the priesthood, and the eternal kind of language that the church uses in this context, where we believe that it, as Catholics, right, that it shapes the person's soul in ways that will echo through eternity, is one of the unique things about Catholicism, that we still hold people to that sort of thing as a result of what we say coming out of our mouths, So it seemed very apropos to me, particularly in the heightened context of chapter 5.
Just picking up on that very briefly, I love this focus on the word, being a person of many words. And in Ireland, the storytelling is so important. I think the encyclical is telling this story too that is really powerful around the ability of wounds to bind, to bless, to heal, to wound. And I think about the focus, for example, on truth. So many times Pope Leo comes to let us be people of truth, let us dialogue with the truth, the person of Jesus Christ. And I think sometimes in conversations around technology, we can stay at the technical level without getting to the deeper realities underneath them. And one of the things that I particularly appreciated was that the end of the encyclical, there's this beautiful language around the Blessed Mother. So herself incarnated the Word within her. The Word became flesh and now dwells within each one of us, right? So the Word, I love Taylor's emphasis on the logic model and how and language-based algorithms are changing even our usage of terminology that we use today. I mean, to tweet, to post, all of that, it's changing in real time. But at the end stands this beautiful invocation to the Blessed Mother as poet, the woman of the Word, and prophetess of redemption. And so I think you have this moment of incarnation of what is being birthed in the church today, what's being birthed in the world, and how will it be redeemed? It's through the witness of the humble, the witness of the one who internalizes the word. And I think Pope Leo is a master storyteller, because it would be easy to get lost in some of the more controversial things that are in there, certain things that media have picked up. But to look at the entire narrative and see how he's built this, he has woven a narrative of hope for us. And if you look at the beginning to the end, it's so clear, it's so beautiful, it's compelling.
Yeah, it's almost as if I think now I'm realizing, as you guys are all talking, like it makes perfect sense that in light of a document about AI, and as you say, Taylor, I had actually written that down, the large language models, and as he's setting up this culture of power, on the one hand, there's a civilization of love that has a very different language model as an answer, right? Like that Christ's language model. I'm reminded as well about there was a great interview with a woman named Maria Popova, I think from Marginalia, where she was talking about how she felt like she kind of drew this connection between Einstein talking about how space-time related to matter, like there's space and time kind of tells matter how to bend, and matter kind of tells space time, how to move. I guess it was something in that relationship. But then she, nonetheless, she drew the connection that I'm not drawing very well, saying that she felt like that really is the way that language is. That like language can kind of affect both ways. Thought can affect language, and language affects thought, like you were saying, Julia. Language kind of gives structure to thought, and thought tells language how to bend. So I think it's a really interesting, because as we're talking about all of these things, it keeps coming up again and again that this is not just a regulation document. This is not just a policy document. This is a recovery, because the church has had all of this from the beginning, from Christ. The church has had this dynamic that truth is not a data set. Truth is a person, and person has these dynamics that are more complicated than just a piece of data or information. Man, I wish I don't have an exact question. I just want you you three smart people to just keep talking about this.
Well, this is why the church, I think, is so concerned about this technology too, because as it touches that very human, like perhaps the most human part of us, where we come to insight when we understand reality, and of course, for a Catholic, understanding reality is understanding being, which is our God with a big B. Anything that kind of help circumvents that or keeps that from happening in the way in which we've been made is deeply concerning for the church, because I think it's helpful too to kind of look at the way in which AI shapes our understanding from the lens of the four transcendentals of truth, beauty, goodness, and being, because each of those ends up being a different aspect of the kinds of cognitive acts that we are doing in conjunction with this artificial intelligence. Truth, of course, being like it is what I'm working with, is what the AI is saying, is what I'm producing, representative of reality. Is it beautiful in the sense that it's something that I have put my own co-creative nature into when I'm shaping an artifact, whether that be a Word document or an image or a video or a song. Am I still putting that in rather than assenting to the statistical generation of it? Am I grasping reality when I'm using all of these tools with regard to the being piece? And of course, with regard to the goodness comes in all of the concern about ethics and the way in which any judgment that we make binds our own selves to the moral actor piece of the whole equation. And so that bundle of understanding AI from the way in which it affects each of our touch points with what Catholicism calls the four transcendentals, I think makes it such an important issue for the church, and why I think a lot of technologists are going to places where they're able to talk in articulate terms about our relationship to those, given whatever religious anthropology you want. But all of our anthropologies touch on those in some deep fashion.
Edmund, you mentioned a little while back AGI, and so it may be useful to just gloss over that for a second. And Taylor just mentioned LLMs, large language models. So AGI is artificial general intelligence. And what that means varies from person to person. I think in general, it means that an AI will eventually become capable of any cognitive act that the human being can achieve. And again, that's very controversial because there are a lot of cognitive acts that are not external and that are not traceable. Some in the field say that large language models are not the way to AGI. And I know, and then some say that we're gonna, Sam says we're gonna be there in 4 years. Elon Musk says 3 years. Demis Hassabis at DeepMind says maybe 5 or 6 years. And Demis is on record as saying he doesn't think AGI will be produced by a large language model. So what is that going to mean? That's going to mean that we're going to usher in a new kind of entity. It probably won't be based on language. It will be based on something that is more native to the AI, which is not language. It's usually code, and it's going to supersede the human capacity for cognitive acts. Nick Bostrom wrote a famous book years ago called Superintelligence. There are a lot of books out there on this subject as well, and I I I think that scares people. I think that scares people when we get to a point, even now to a certain extent, some will tell you, we really don't know what the AI is doing. I think that's part of what generative AI is about. It goes on its own. They're calling this a black box. Now, some technologists have told me that we can trace what the AIs are doing, at least for the large platforms now. If you ask it, it'll go back and it will tell you how it got to the answer. I think we're going to eventually get to a point where we can't do that anymore, where the answer came in a way that we don't know, and that we can't trace, and I think that's going to be the big issue. So you mentioned AGI, artificial general intelligence, because right now what we have is specific into artificial intelligence. It's very good for doing certain tasks, but it can't run the gambit of all of cognitive activities of the human mind. So I remember in Loyola, I don't know, Julianne, you said you're from Loyola Prep. Is that in LA?
Loyola Press is was the publisher of Loyola University in Chicago.
Oh, Prep. Okay, sorry. Because I gave a talk in LA, and one of the students came up to me and said, "Father, put yourself in my position. I'm just starting my career. I'm learning how to use these tools. What do you suggest that I do?" And I said, focus in on what makes us specifically human and forget about everything else, because eventually AIs are going to be able to do that. But AIs will never be able to do what makes us specifically human. What constitutes our specific humanity? That that requires reflection. That requires, and Pope Leo gives some indications in the encyclical about that. But I think that's going to be the key, and this has already been mentioned here also this morning. Uh, what what makes us human, and that is what is going to allow us to survive and flourish in an age of AI.
I think this is such an interesting point that both you and Taylor are making around intelligence. And I think even the question of intelligence, what does it mean to be intelligent today? And I think what Pope Leo is reminding us is these values, these timeless truths. We don't just emphasize the intelligence or the capacity of the human person to think, but also to be wise, to discern, to dialogue with their own conscience, to reflect, as St. Ignatius of Loyola would say, to reflect on your own reflecting, because that is where growth comes. And I think one of my favorite aspects of the encyclical comes up because he goes through this whole section on war and armed conflict and serious social tensions. He even mentions that we cannot rule out the possibility that some leaders may consider armed conflict as an effective way of diverting attention from domestic problems as a cynical tool for managing difficulties. You can look that up in section 208, because I thought to myself, there's manipulation that's happening. Intelligence can be manipulated in a lot of ways. Discernment, both individual and communal, indicates that we are dialoguing with greater authority. Obviously, we're dialoguing with the Lord. We're dialoguing with God. We're allowing communal discernment to guide us so that there's checks and balances in place. But right after he says that, he gets to this beautiful section. It's in 211. He says, even in the darkest nights, the Lord raises up men and women who refuse to give up, who persevere in doing good, who protect the vulnerable, and open pathways to reconciliation. I love this next piece. The memory of the saints, righteous people, and the oft forgotten peacemakers show us that grace does not magically eliminate conflict, but instead it inspires active resistance to evil. And I love this piece, an astonishing creativity in doing good. Artificial technology can give us output and can actually mimic human creativity, but it cannot replicate human discernment, prayer, and true creativity, which is always lived out in relationship to the Creator, as Taylor says. So I think all of us here are writers. We've all written either books or articles. And one of the most painful things that you can do is reflect on your own reflecting, on the wounds that have caused you some growth in your life. And if every act of writing is always this undertaking with God of, what do you want me to say? Not what do people need to hear today? And I think in that space, Leo shines. He's not just giving us an encyclical on a what and the how. Here's what you need to know and here's how you do the things. But he's calling us back to the who and the why of the human person, but even more deeply to our faith, to our relationship with God, the Creator. That's the first thing we learn about him in the Bible. It's the first attribute of God. God is the Creator. In the book of Genesis, he creates out of the formless void. And so AI can seem like a formless void, a bottomless pit of information for people. But God is going to create in and out of that through the people that he calls forth for this time in the life of the church. I think people sometimes can be too scared, like, oh gosh, let's run from this. But God is raising up the very generation of people in various spaces to have these conversations, to educate, to create, but also to walk with people who've been wounded and harmed by models that maybe prioritize, industry and materialism over the dignity of the human person.
Taylor, I wonder your thoughts on just piggybacking on what Julianne's saying here. It reminds me of paragraph 233. It's part of the conclusion as Pope Leo starts this conclusion. He says, even when machines excel in efficiency, a human face that asks to be gazed upon remains the center of our history. And Julianne, I think it's kind of, it was making me think of that while you were talking about our call to relationship, and that Jesus is truth and truth is relationship with a person. Jesus is truth and is a person that has to be gazed upon. Taylor, like what is the practicals? Like these can be big, scary ideas, but like in your experience, how do people navigate integrating these principles and these values into their use with AI? So if they're not going to just cut themselves off completely, but they do want to use AI in some way, and in particular, I know you, with the Institute, I saw in there that you talk about agentic systems, which maybe people aren't as familiar with, but like not just AIs that generate one prompt back, but AIs that you're interacting with that are going and doing tasks on your behalf and then coming back. Like, how do you keep that gazing on the face of Christ? How do you keep that personal? How would someone go about integrating these values into AI use?
Yeah, certainly. Well, first, I think taking the example of Nehemiah that Pope Leo uses, before he went about his work, he fasted and prayed, and that kind of puts you in the right mindset. There's a concept in the tech side of what we call metacognitive strategies, and the individuals and teams who are able to utilize AI to the greatest productivity and creativity effect are ones who spend a lot of time on their metacognitive strategies. Now, metacognitive is a $50 word, but all it means is before I go and do something, I'm going to think about how I'm going to do it. So, for example, there's been a number of research studies that have pointed this direction. But, for example, some of the fantastic ways in which scientists have used these models to produce some really incredible research, but in protein folding and molecular discovery and all sorts of areas of science, is that they'll spend weeks creating a 50-page long prompt with all of their expertise in it, where they're doing a whole heck of a lot of thinking about what they want the tool to do for them. Now, I suggest that we should be doing the same thing when we go to the tool, rather than kind of YOLOing a question into it and trusting the response back. Rather, we should be approaching like, what am I trying to get out of this tool? Is it similar? Am I using it a similar way to scrolling on your favorite image social media app? Or am I trying to work with it in a cognitive sort of way where I too am getting smarter as a result of wrestling with this tool that is helping me think differently in a certain sort of way? Now I can hand that over. I can use the tool to be an arm crank for just generating answers for me, or I can work with it to kind of get a better understanding of what I'm trying to do from a generative standpoint. So that's the generative side. The agentic side is even more concerning, right? Because, and you can use the analogy of like a principal and an agent in like legal theory. When I, hire a gardener to take care of my garden, I've defined the framework in which that gardener should operate. But if the gardener, for example, gardens somebody else's garden, I'm still responsible for that because I hired the gardener to do the work in that fashion, and the legal theory behind principal and agent still applies. It's very much moving in that direction for us as operators of these agents. When they go off and do something, we're responsible for that action. And so we have to know what they can do. We have to know what they are going off and doing. We have to understand the technology to the extent that when it goes and does that, I maintain responsibility for the thing that it is going and doing. And so that kind of throws a little bit of research on us to understand, like, hey, when I do ask the thing to go and do something, what is it doing? How is it going about doing that? Am I comfortable with signing my name to the bottom of whatever this agent has done on my behalf, because I am the responsible party in the situation? And so there's some learning that comes along with that. There's having to know the tech that you're working with, but also there's this kind of discernment process of I am relating to this technology, and this tool is going to be shaping me in substantive ways too. And I need to be aware of that in my own interactions with it.
Yeah, that's been my experience personally. I think I would encourage people that are listening who are comfortable trying to use AI in an ethical fashion, to lean into what you're describing, because I remember when I first started out, my idea was, write an article or write a paragraph or something, and very quickly you realize that you just get average answers. But then what you're describing, Taylor, is exactly what you quickly kind of realize is, okay, well, how do I define a good article? Like, what methods do I use, or what evaluation criteria for a good article? And what is it I'm really trying to accomplish actually? And then, and it kind of like, I mean, even if I think if people don't know the word metacognitive strategies and aren't trying to do this, I think it kind of starts as you're using it over time. You start thinking more and more like, oh, I could let these agents go work longer if I just step back further and just describe the goal or the plan, right?
Yeah, also using them in adversarial sorts of ways is fantastic too. Like, here's the question I have: why is this a dumb question? Or what? What's a better question here? Or how would Father Philip respond to this? Or how would Julianne respond to this? And knowing that it's not going to be Father Philip, it's not going to be Julianne, but it's going to try to approximate a viewpoint different than my own when challenging me with the kinds of thinking that I'm trying to do. And working with the tool in this fashion, and again, it's a tool because it will do whatever you prompt it within a probabilistic sort of range, just like any other computer program, right? And so you're training the tool to work with you in particular kinds of ways as well. A lot of these tools too have kind of custom instruction spaces that you're able to put in long-term sorts of ways in which you desire the tool to interact with you. Some examples of what I put in there is I like primary sources wherever possible. And so I've told my tools, give me primary sources along with the links to them so that I can go audit whatever I'm working with you on. I've given it a list of all of the books that I've ever read, and I keep it updated. And I ask it to include sentences or themes from those books as a way of helping my own memory of keeping what I've read alive as part of my working with it as well. Another way in which I've asked it to interact with me too is just to be straight and to the point rather than to kind of wander around or provide a lot of superfluous language when I want more succinct sorts of answers. And those sorts of ways of shaping the tool to your own interests, demands, concerns about your own, the way in which the tool shapes your own thinking, you have the bull by the horns here, and you have a lot of control over how that happens.
There are some really interesting parallels with spirituality and spiritual metacognitive abilities. So you start to see, some of the newer language that's emerging is rooted in things like deep contemplation, reflective intentionality, even things like mindfulness in terms of how you look at and building the prompts in. I think there's some really interesting conversations around this and how it's showing up, particularly with advising people around their spiritual health. I think we've seen some of the dangers that are out there, but I also think if we can look at it positively, how can we harness some of the positive aspects to help build new ways, new pathways of understanding for people of their own spirituality? I would love to see this kind of level of discourse and intentionality around, how people are using it for spiritual companionship and spiritual direction, and what is the proper place of spiritual direction and spiritual companioning in terms of helping people think about their own thinking, but even more deeply to reflect on their own being. That's one of the things that we can't get to as deeply with some of the metacognitive strategies, that we can reflect on the reflecting, but the being. How do we reflect on our own being and what brings peace? I think that there's a fascinating dialogue to be had there with spiritual practitioners.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Taylor that I've never seen a 50-page prompt before. That's tough to get my head around, but yeah, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Prompts are usually like a sentence or two.
Yeah, well, it's helpful to
Uh,
have unlimited tokens when you're doing such things, and so you have to be in special places for unlimited tokens.
Yeah. 50-page prompt. But
Yeah,
how to give cause to the AI.
Yeah, that stuff. In my own experience, that stuff, and I think this is relevant for people listening. I mean, even if you're not going to build complicated agentic systems, I mean, it's something I talk to people a lot about, even if when they're just starting out with AI, that that they would be fascinated by this. By context engineering is another big term that comes up a lot. That you can quickly have. Maybe you don't have a 50-page prompt directly, but you might have a fairly large prompt that says to go to other files and get those that context and take other steps to get other context, and then take this kind of like summary of multiple maybe smaller prompts together. And it's really interesting when you start thinking in that way, like those kind of foundational documents. It again brings us back to Anthropic and the Constitution. This is an 80-page constitution that they've put out as, hey, this is how we're putting something transparent in front of everyone. This is what we're trying to build as the foundations for training our AI models. And I think that's something that even people that don't use AI would be interested in, and kind of see how the secular world or Silicon Valley very quickly gets to, okay, well, how am I going to define some of these things? In the Constitution, there's words like value and wisdom, goodness and ethics and things like that. And that's fascinating. Even though we believe that AI are not human persons, they're using they use human language to reason, and so there has to be this human language kind of baked into this ethics that we're building around them.
Yeah, well, no,
And by the way, if you go to the end of that constitution, you'll see some of the signatories. One is Archbishop Paul Ty, who's the secretary for the Dicastery for Communication and Education. One is Brian Greene, the head of the Mark Rule Center at Santa Clara, and there are several others. So it's very well done, by the way. And
Little plug there
that
for
was
Bishop Paul. He was my moral theology professor in college, so
there you
it's
go.
really interesting. Yeah, he's now working in the area of culture and communications at the Vatican, but I initially encountered him in Ireland 25 years ago. I'm really dating myself as a moral theology professor, which gives me great comfort, Father Philip, that someone is coming in with such an eye for culture and communication, but embedded in moral frameworks. So I appreciate you mentioning him among others.
he was also the person who did most of the drafting of the Antica Nova, which is the Vatican's document in 2025. And he's a wonderful person. We just had him here at Boston College 2 months ago, and he gave a talk on AI. He's very down to earth. He's very humble. He doesn't like the spotlight, but he was the one that forged the original relationship with Anthropic, and so I think that's also why you saw Christopher at the presentation.
Hmm. Well, as we start wrapping up here, I just want to continue. Any other practical, takeaways at the close here, or anything you would encourage people listening? Like, a lot of this can sound overwhelming, scary, above my pay grade kind of thing. But I think a reading of this document, like the disarming of our words and those things, it is a recovery of just like returning to the sources of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Any other thoughts as people are going to wake up tomorrow and go, all right, well, what now?
Read the document.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Vole
for sure.
legere.
Yeah. Anything else, Julianne?
Yeah, for me, I would say read the document, but pray with the document. I would say you can read it and look for your favorite quote or your favorite little memeable, thing to put out on Instagram. But more deeply than that, I think suspend maybe some of your judgment and bias going in and really press into the places that are most concerning and challenging for you and make a note of those and why. Why do they make you feel fearful? And then circle back to those places, like, for example, being a weaver of hope, pull one thread of hope out of the document for you. I think we break down barriers around disinformation and fear when we allow people to cling to one thread that's comfortable and then bring them into a deeper narrative. So I would say pray through the document. And then I would say at the parish level, I would love to see parishes have a conversation with young people about this. And not just young people, it can be multi-generational, but this is directly impacting the mental and spiritual health of our young people. Fear, I'm even seeing young people, even including my own kids, they're in high school thinking about what careers that they shouldn't get into because they're going to be replaced by AI. Parishes should be at the forefront of these conversations, shaping that narrative of what it means to be truly human today in an age where this is an exciting technology, but also comes with moral limits, and we have to be at the center of that. So read, pray, reflect, and I would say respond. Have a response. Talk to your friends. Talk to people in your pew about it.
Taylor, what about you, man? Any kind of closing thoughts of
the key thing to understand here, and I appreciate Father Philip's comments with regard to AGI, but there's a growing number of technologists who are realizing that there's and provably showing that there's a category difference between what we're creating in the artificial intelligence space and how our own intellect works. And so I think that there's a great deal of value in understanding the technology. And this isn't to say that everybody should become a technologist or build models or, learn how to code or anything along those lines. But understanding the technology helps disarm it in many ways, right? There's it's just a thing, The reason why it sounds human is because it was trained on everything human ever wrote. The reason why it can come up with the right emotive context is because when we wrote the billion times that I was sad when my dog died, when I mentioned my dog died, it knows that sadness is something that also should come along with that and can respond in that kind, right? And so it can feel very human, it can sound very human, but all it's doing is rearranging the artifacts of humanity that we've encoded in language over the last few millennia in every major language on Earth. And so there's this onus, I think, on us as technologists, definitely, but also us as educators, us as more intelligent people, training our young folks coming up, who of course are intelligent too, but you know what I mean, of helping them understand, like, this is a thing, and this is how to operate with it, and it's a tool, and don't hype yourself up that it's anything different. And we I think we owe that to ensure that the field remains fresh for the new minds coming into it.
Mm. Well, I want to thank all of you just for being sitting in this tension, and also, just striving to be faithful witnesses to Christ in this, and wading into this conversation. And in a past episode of the Faith and AI project with Leticia Garcia, she mentioned the importance of what she called learning communities, I think was the phrase. And like that's what I feel in these conversations, is that it really is in these communities where we're having these conversations and dialogue that we're learning this new language, or we're learning how to navigate these challenges. So I just want to thank all of you for the work you're doing and for the faithfulness you have to Christ in all of this.
Right back at you. Grateful for this learning community that you've developed.
Well,
Thanks for having
awesome.
us
Well,
this morning, Edmund.
yeah, thank you for being here. I want to just remind everyone that the Faith in AI project is a project that exists to help people understand, navigate, and harness AI with the wisdom, confidence, and hope of the church. And so we invite you to tune into the next episode. It'll be the third in this series, where we'll be continuing to dive into this new encyclical. And we thank you for being here.